Welcome back to Revise and Resubmit, the podcast that takes, those really dense academic papers and makes them surprisingly interesting. I'm Pavlov.
And I'm Nikita.
We've noticed a lot of you are tuning in, which is amazing, but I haven't quite hit that subscribe button yet.
Yeah, and that little button, honestly, it's so small, but it makes such a huge difference in helping us reach more people with these important discussions.
Right. It's true. Like the algorithms, those mysterious forces that decide what we all see and hear, they pay a lot of attention to subscriber numbers.
Yeah, think of it like the subscribing. It's like casting a vote for quality content, So these insightful research discussions don't just get lost in the sea of all the information out there.
More subscribers equals more visibility. Right. And that means more resources for us to make even deeper dives for you.
Yeah.
Maybe bring in experts for interviews, even do some live Q&A sessions where you can jump in.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about building a community around research,
Yeah.
where curiosity thrives and knowledge is like shared and debated.
Ever get that feeling like you're drowning in information?
Yeah.
You just want the good stuff, right? The insights that really make you go, aha. Well, that's what we do here on the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on a question that might seem pretty basic on the surface. What does it actually take for an organization to exist, like right from the very beginning? We've got some fascinating material from Katz and Gartner, published back in 1988, and it really gets into the nitty-gritty of what they call emerging organizations. It's kind of like trying to understand the DNA of a brand new company before it even hits the market.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to think about it. We spend so much time talking about those big established organizations, the ones that are already household names. But how did they get there? What were those very first steps? This work helps us see how something actually transitions from an idea to a real functioning organization, and how we can even recognize it in those early, often messy stages.
Right, it's like trying to figure out how a skyscraper was built just by looking at the finished building. You miss all the planning and construction that went into it. So one of the first things Katz and Gartner tackle is, how do you even spot a brand new organization in the wild? It seems like it should be obvious, but they point out that a lot of the traditional ways we think about organizations kind of assume they already exist. It's like the instruction manual starts after the machine is already put together.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. You see, a lot of those classic theories about organizations, the ones that talk about hierarchies and culture and all that, they often assume a certain level of maturity. And that can create a real blind spot when we're trying to understand those very first moments of creation. Other researchers like Aldrich, Rosen, and Woodward were also wrestling with this problem around the same time. They argued that we need to study organizations in creation, the actual process of becoming, not just the finished product. It's a subtle but really important distinction.
It is. It really is. It's like trying to understand how a seed sprouts and grows just by looking at a fully grown tree. You miss all those crucial early stages. And getting a handle on these fundamental properties of emerging organizations isn't just an academic exercise, is it? Katz and Gartner argue that having a clearer understanding of these initial elements could actually have a big impact on how we study new organizations in fields like population ecology.
That's right. Population ecology looks at how whole categories of organizations are born and die off, kind of like, studying the ecosystem of a forest. And the other big area is entrepreneurship, obviously. It's all about those individuals who are driving the creation of new ventures.
So having a more precise way to define what an emerging organization actually is could give researchers better tools to identify them, track them, and ultimately understand them better.
Exactly. And it could also help us move beyond relying on what Katz and Gartner calls samples of convenience.
Samples of convenience. What do they mean by that?
Well, it's basically when researchers study new organizations that are easy to find and get information about. Like, let's say a big company spins off one of its divisions into a separate company, or two companies merge together, or even when a business just relocates to a new city. These events are easy to track, but they might not actually represent the birth of something truly new.
I see. So it might look like a new organization is being created, but it's really just a rearrangement of existing pieces.
Right. And another common approach is to just use data on new business and corporations. But as Birch and McCracken pointed out, a lot of entrepreneurial activity can happen under the radar, as a side hustle or a partnership, long before anyone files the paperwork to make it official.
So if we just rely on who's filed the right forms, We might miss a whole universe of emerging organizations that are out there hustling but haven't hit that formal stage yet.
Exactly. We could be missing a huge chunk of those early vulnerable phases where so much of the interesting stuff is happening.
Okay, so it sounds like we need a better way to define and identify these emerging organizations. And Katz and Gartner point out that a lot of the existing definitions of what an organization is tend to focus on characteristics that only show up once it's already gotten to a certain size or has some history behind it.
Right. It's like trying to use the features of a full-grown adult to describe a newborn baby.
Right.
They're just different stages of development. You know, you think about those textbook definitions that talk about having a formal organizational structure, a clear division of labor, or even just a minimum number of employees.
Yeah, I remember reading those. Lots of boxes to check off before you could even be considered an organization.
Exactly. And those kinds of definitions automatically exclude those very early stages where it might just be a solo founder working from their kitchen table or a small group of people collaborating on an idea. They haven't formalized anything yet, but there's definitely something brewing. And Katz and Gartner point out that even some of the most influential thinkers in organization theory, like Etzioni, March, and Simon, even Barnard, often included elements in their definitions that assumed a certain level of established structure or a minimum headcount. So the very way we've traditionally defined organizations might unintentionally be blinding us to their origins.
It's almost like we're using the wrong measuring stick. Now, the paper also talks about these different schools of thought when it comes to defining organizations, the structuralist view versus the process view. Can you break those down for us?
Sure. So the structuralist view, associated with thinkers like Weber and Blau, it tends to focus on the more concrete aspects of an organization. Like, think about the organizational chart, the formal rules and procedures, the division of tasks and responsibilities. It's about the static framework, the blueprint, if you will.
I'm picturing one of those detailed diagrams with boxes and lines showing who reports to whom.
Exactly. Now, the process view, on the other hand, takes a different approach. Think Week, Saracen, folks like that. They're more interested in the ongoing activities, the interactions between people, the way decisions get made, how information flows, how problems are solved. It's less about the static structure and more about the dynamic flow of action.
Okay, so it's not just about the blueprint. It's about how people actually work together, how they create and inhabit that structure.
Exactly. And Katz and Gartner highlight that research in entrepreneurship often takes yet another route, focusing less on formal definitions and more on the kind of business being started.
Right, like whether it's a manufacturing company or a tech startup or a restaurant.
Yeah, and that makes sense. Entrepreneurship is all about action, about getting things done, but it doesn't necessarily dive into those core organizational properties that we're talking about here. So you might know that it's a new bakery, but you haven't really examined what makes it an organization in those early stages from a theoretical perspective.
Got it. So we need a definition that can bridge these different perspectives and capture those early, more fluid stages of development. And Katz and Gartner point to a definition by Mukhopadhyay as being particularly useful for understanding these emerging organizations.
Yes. His definition of an organization as a myopically purposeful, boundary-maintaining activity system really hits the sweet spot here.
Myopically purposeful. It's a pretty interesting phrase. What's he getting at with that?
Well, he's capturing that initial, often very intense focus you see with new ventures, where they're kind of laser focused on a specific goal or problem, almost to the exclusion of everything else. They might not have all the answers yet, but they're driven by a clear sense of purpose, even if their vision is still a bit blurry.
That makes sense. And the boundary maintaining activity system, part of his definition.
Right. That's getting at the idea that there's a distinct entity starting to take shape. Something that's trying to define itself and hold its own in the world. It's actively engaged in doing things, and it's trying to maintain some sort of boundary between itself and the outside world.
So it's more than just an idea. It's starting to take on a life of its own.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, as the paper highlights, that these organizations emerge from the interactions between the people involved and their surrounding environment, which leads to what Katz and Kahn called emergent properties. It's not just the sum of its parts, it's something new and different that arises from that interaction.
So it's like the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts.
Right, like mixing ingredients together to bake a cake, you end up with something that's totally different from the individual ingredients. Now, getting to the meat of it, Katz and Gartner identify 4 key properties that they argue are essential for defining an emerging organization.
Okay, lay it on us. What are these fundamental building blocks?
The 4 properties are intentionality, resources, boundary, and exchange. They stress that each of these has both structural and process elements, and together they represent the bare minimum for something to be considered an organization.
Okay, let's break those down one by one, starting with intentionality. What does that mean in the context of a brand new organization?
Intentionality in this context is about the active pursuit of information to create a new organization. It's like that spark of an idea that says, hey, I think I can do this. I think I can make this happen. And it's not just a fleeting thought. It's an active pursuit, an intention to actually bring something new into the world.
So it's about gathering knowledge, formulating a plan, figuring out what it would take to make this idea a reality.
Right. And this intentionality is shaped both by the founder's own motivations, their goals and aspirations, and also by the environment they're operating in. Think about things like the availability of funding, the state of the industry, technological advancements, government regulations, even the local community. All of these factors feed into that initial intention.
So it's a combination of internal drive and external factors. And how does that initial intentionality evolve as the organization starts to take shape?
As the organization moves from being just an idea to a functioning entity, its goals and purposes become increasingly separate from the founder's original vision and also from the broader environment. It's like the organization starts to develop its own identity, its own sense of purpose. And this evolving intentionality manifests in various ways. You see it in the development of a unique organizational culture.
Right, those shared values and norms that start to emerge as people work together.
Exactly. You also see it in the symbolic aspects of the organization, its branding, its mission statement, how it presents itself to the world.
So it's like the initial spark of an idea is gradually crystallizing into a more defined and shared sense of purpose. Okay, let's move on to the second property. Resources. I feel like we hear about resources all the time in the business world. What's the specific angle here when we're talking about emerging organizations?
When we talk about resources in this context, we're talking about the tangible building blocks, the raw materials that make it possible for the organization to do what it sets out to do. So this could be financial capital.
The money needed to get started, pay expenses and all that.
Right. And it also includes human capital, the skills, knowledge, and experience of the people involved.
The brain power, the talent that drives the organization forward.
Exactly. And then there's the physical stuff, the office space, the equipment, raw materials if they're making something. And of course, access to credit is crucial, especially in those early stages.
It's about having the tools you need to actually execute on your vision.
And as several researchers have pointed out, the availability of these resources plays a huge role in shaping the organization's strategic direction. Like, do they focus on a local market or try to go national? Do they bootstrap or seek outside investment? All of these decisions are influenced by the resources they have at their disposal.
And then the third property is boundary. Katz and Gartner point out that this is a crucial but often overlooked element in traditional organization theory. What makes it so important, especially for an emerging organization?
A boundary is essentially what separates the organization from its environment. It defines what's inside and what's outside, what belongs to the organization and what doesn't. It's what allows the organization to start controlling its own resources, to make its own decisions, to establish its own identity. So it's a really important step in the process of becoming a distinct entity.
Okay, so it's about drawing a line in the sand.
And on a practical level, this boundary often becomes visible through things like formal incorporation, getting a tax ID number, setting up a business bank account, securing a physical address, creating a website, even getting a business phone line. All of these actions signal that this is no longer just a person or a group of people. It's a separate entity with its own identity and its own operations.
So those seemingly mundane tasks are actually key milestones in the life of an emerging organization.
Right. And this boundary also serves to distinguish the individual or individuals who started the organization from the organization itself. It's like saying, hey, this is the organization and it's separate from me and my personal life.
Got it. It's creating that separation, that distinction between the founder and the venture.
Yeah.
Okay, and finally we come to the fourth property exchange. It feels like this one might be the most dynamic and constantly evolving, especially in those early stages.
Definitely. Exchange, in this context, refers to those cycles of transactions and interactions that the organization engages in, both internally and externally. So this could be things like buying supplies, hiring employees, selling products or services, interacting with customers, forming partnerships.
The give and take of doing business.
Exactly. And Katz and Gartner emphasize that these exchanges don't always have to be profitable or efficient, especially in the early stages. A new organization might be willing to sell its products at a loss just to gain market share, or it might make deals that aren't ideal just to get its foot in the door. What's crucial is that the organization is actively engaging in transactions with the outside world, that it's participating in the marketplace.
So it's not just about turning a profit right away. It's about establishing those connections, those flows of goods and services.
And these exchanges leave a trail, in the form of invoices, receipts, contracts, customer feedback, and all that. And this data can provide valuable insights into how the organization is operating and evolving. Now, one thing that Katz and Gartner point out is that these 4 properties might not always appear at the exact same time. There might be a period, what they call the pre-organizational period, where some of these elements are present, but not all of them.
So it's like a gestation period, a time of preparation and development before the organization is fully formed.
Exactly. And during this pre-organizational period, some crucial decisions are often made, like what industry to focus on, where to locate the business, what kind of organizational structure to adopt, who the target market is. So it's a really important phase, even though it might not be as visible as the later stages.
And it's interesting that they suggest using these 4 properties themselves as a way to identify and study emerging organizations earlier in their development. Like, instead of waiting for a company to formally incorporate, you could look for evidence of intentionality or resource acquisition as early signals that something is brewing.
That's right. And because boundary and exchange have been more expensively studied as ways to identify new organizations, they suggest that focusing on intention and resources might be particularly fruitful for catching those even earlier stages.
Okay, so let's talk about intention as an early warning sign. How do we practically identify this nascent intentionality? Where do we look?
Well, if we think of intention as individuals actively showing an interest in creating an organization, then there are a lot of places we might look. Think about subscription lists for magazines and websites aimed at entrepreneurs.
People who are seeking out information and inspiration.
Exactly. And what about membership lists for organizations that cater to new business owners? Networking groups, professional associations, things like that, and directories of students and recent graduates, especially in fields where there's a high rate of self-employment.
People who are trained in a specific skill and might be considering striking out on their own?
Yeah. And client lists for those small business development centers, the SBDCs, those government-funded organizations that provide counseling and training to entrepreneurs. Those are definitely hotbeds of intentionality.
And then there are all those corporate entrepreneurship programs that are popping up where big companies are trying to foster innovation and new venture creation within their own walls.
Right. And even those conferences and workshops focused on things like social entrepreneurship, addressing community issues, those can be really fertile ground for organizational emergence.
So it's about looking for those spaces where people are actively engaging with the idea of starting something new, whether it's a for-profit business or a nonprofit organization, or even a community initiative.
Exactly. The information-seeking behavior itself is a strong indicator of that underlying intention. Now, what about using resources as an early indicator?
Yeah, what kind of signals should we be paying attention to there?
Well, the obvious ones are those traditional resource categories: money, physical space, equipment, employees. But if we broaden our definition of resources to include information and knowledge, then some of those intention-related sources can also give us clues about resource acquisition.
Right, because information is a crucial resource, especially in the early stages.
Absolutely. But we can also look for more concrete indicators, like applications for loans from banks and other lending institutions, applications for grants from foundations and government agencies, job postings that signal a need for human capital, even lists of new tenants in commercial buildings. Those are all pretty strong signals that someone is actively acquiring resources and building something new.
Okay, so we've got these 4 properties, and we've got some ideas about how to spot them in the wild. Now, Katz and Gartner go on to discuss how focusing on these elements can impact both how we think about organizations and how we actually study them.
Right, because remember, a lot of traditional organization theory focuses on those later stages of development when the organization is already more established. By shifting our attention to those earlier stages, those emerging phases, we can start to develop a more nuanced understanding of how organizations come into being. And that could lead to some pretty significant changes in how we think about organizational life cycles, for example.
Instead of just looking at the finished product, we're getting a glimpse into the messy, dynamic process of creation.
Exactly. And this has implications for different fields of study. Take population ecology, for instance, which looks at the dynamics of organizational populations. Katz and Gartner suggests that if we focus on those very early stages of development, we might see a much higher degree of diversity in organizational forms than we currently recognize.
Because once those organizations mature, they tend to become more similar to each other.
Right. They face similar environmental pressures, they start to copy each other's successful strategies, and they become more institutionalized, which basically means they start to conform to the norms and expectations of their industry. But in those early stages, there's more room for experimentation, for trying out different approaches, for being truly innovative.
And they also suggest that the idea of the liability of newness might actually be stronger than we realize if we're able to study organizations at an even earlier stage.
Yeah, the liability of newness is this idea that newer organizations are more likely to fail than older, more established ones. And the research on this has been a bit mixed. Some studies have found a pretty strong effect, while others have found a more modest effect. But Katz and Gartner argue that the studies that have found only a modest effect might be missing something important because they often rely on data that's based on formal incorporation records, which, again, only captures a certain point in time.
So we might be missing a lot of those very early ventures that never even make it to the point of incorporation.
Exactly. And those early ventures are likely the most vulnerable, the most likely to fail. So by using intention-based studies, where we look for those early signals of entrepreneurial activity, we might be able to capture those organizations that are at the highest risk of failure and learn a lot more about why some ventures succeed while others don't.
And then, of course, there are the implications for entrepreneurship research.
Right. And a big challenge in entrepreneurship research has been to really focus on the dynamic process of creating organizations, as Vesper and others have argued. You know, Schumpeter, who is kind of like the godfather of entrepreneurship theory, he saw entrepreneurship as being all about creating new things, new technologies, new products, new markets, new organizational forms. And Katz and Gartner's framework really aligns with that view because it helps us to zero in on those early stages where all the creative energy is happening.
Instead of just studying those ventures that have already made it, we're looking at the process of creation itself.
Exactly. And that could lead to some really interesting insights into how entrepreneurs make decisions, how they acquire resources, how they build relationships, how they navigate uncertainty. And Vesper also introduced this intriguing idea of near misses organizations that almost make it but then fizzle out before they ever become formally established.
Those ventures that never even show up in the official statistics.
Right. And Katz and Gartner suggests that because we tend to focus on those organizations that have achieved some level of success, we might be underestimating the sheer amount of entrepreneurial activity that's actually happening out there.
So it's not just about the success stories, it's about understanding the whole ecosystem of entrepreneurial effort, including the failures and the near misses.
Precisely. And that can give us a much richer understanding of what it actually takes to create a successful new venture.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into the foundational properties of emerging organizations.
Yeah.
It seems like the key takeaway is that by focusing on intentionality, resources, boundary, and exchange, we can gain a much deeper understanding of how organizations come into being.
Yes. And it helps us to bridge that gap between organization theory and entrepreneurship to see how these two fields are interconnected.
So for you, dear listener, I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge. Think about those projects or initiatives that you might be involved in right now. Maybe you're starting a new business or launching a community program or even just working on a side hustle. Ask yourself, are all those four elements present? Do you have a clear intention? Have you gathered the necessary resources? Have you established a clear boundary between this project and the rest of your life? And are you engaging in some kind of exchange with the outside world?
Those are the key ingredients, and thinking about them carefully can make all the difference in whether your venture succeeds or fizzles out.
Thanks for joining us. And don't forget to subscribe to Revise and Resubmit on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show and want to support us in creating more insightful content, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every contribution helps us continue this journey of exploration and discovery. Until next time, keep those minds curious, keep questioning, and keep revising and resubmitting.